hardly a sign of times past, BBC Two now investigates the mystery of the Cheshire bog bodies.
The Celts on the whole didn't think of their gods as being up in the sky. The entrance to the other world was down watery places. You honoured the gods by making sacrifices in pools in peat bogs.
A body in a bog is a complete entity of life at some point in history. With all this forensic evidence, there seems to be an opportunity to demonstrate not just something about that particular individual, but about the whole lifestyle and community that it came from. It's a very attractive notion. I was brought up in Yorkshire. When I was a lad, my parents used to take me out and show me all kinds of bits of countryside. And I remember once in the middle of the Pennines seeing this wonderful section of peat just off the road and going up to it, somewhat to my parents' concern, and feeling this lovely black soil and being really fascinated by it. And then later, when I was a Boy Scout, I remember going on these hikes and so on and seeing real vegetation, bits of wood in the side of these peat cuttings, and thinking it was fantastic that these could be preserved and be recognisable after hundreds if not thousands of years. This bog is about 30 feet deep. I don't know whether you can see the ground shaking. It is doing, but it demonstrates, it illustrates that between us and terra firma there's a heck of a lot of space, and most of this space is taken up not with anything very solid, but with this water. This little pool has been colonised by water-loving plants, which are slowly going to consume the water to create peat. And the same processes which help to preserve peat can preserve other things. For example, bodies.
In 1982, completely out of the blue, we were given information that a man called Peter Reyn-Bardt had murdered his wife some 22 years before. As far as we knew, Reyn-Bardt was completely homosexual. But eventually, after many inquiries at churches and the records office in Manchester, we did turn up this record of the marriage on the 28th of March 1959 between Edwin Reyn-Bardt, which he had changed actually by deed poll, and Malika Maria de Fernandez. In 1960, the record stopped dead. There was no further trace. Maria, or Malika Reyn-Bardt, ceased to exist at that time. Mr. Reyn-Bardt came in of his own accord. He completely denied that he'd murdered his wife. He told us a story that she had been pressuring him for money and that she was about to cause trouble, that she'd turned up at the cottage which he shared with his homosexual partner and demanded money. This is a general view down the garden from the house, and you can see the wilderness into which it progresses, and the peat fields are just at the back of here. Mr. Reyn-Bardt said that they'd sat down and worked it all out amicably, and at the end of the day he'd driven her into Wilmslow, he dropped her off to get some cigarettes, and she then disappeared, presumably to the railway station, and he never saw her again. We had no evidence really to go against that, so we've come to a dead end.
Good evening. 4 years ago, Pete Cutters, working at Tolland in North Jutland in Denmark, reported to the police that they had found a body.
In 1950, some workmen were cutting peat over here, and on a very bright day in May, they found right here a dead body. It was soon discovered that this was not a recent murder victim, but one of the best preserved bog bodies we know of.
Friday the 13th of May 1983, two of the peat cutters were working this trench along here when they dug up what they thought was possibly a dinosaur egg, but it turned out to be something rather different than that.
When a body or part of a body is found in suspicious circumstances, a Home Office forensic pathologist will be asked to examine it. This is his report. In my opinion, this is the skull of a European female, most probably in the 30 to 50 year age group. I have examined this skull with the kind help of Mr. Connolly of the Department of Anatomy, University of Liverpool.
It had got some brain material in the cranial cavity. There was a bit of one eye there, and some of the optic nerve still there. There was a piece of scalp in place with some black hair on the scalp, and we, without doing any bone chemistry, we estimated that it was 20 to 50 years old, something like that.
This is a suspicious death, and if it's been buried 20 years, the likelihood is that the killer is somewhere out there.
Now, the authorities found Tolland man a matter of extreme interest. In the first place, they dated it to the early Iron Age, 2,000 years ago. It was presented to them as a problem because how had this particular crime happened, if it was a crime? How had the man met his end? That was the first problem. And the second one was the interest, the excellent way in which the body had been preserved.
Many people find it hard to believe that this man died more than 23 centuries ago, and that feeling gets even stronger when you look at this beautifully preserved face. It is a very peaceful expression, as though he's just sleeping and can awake any moment. You can clearly see many details, the closed eyes, the beard stubbles, which have a red color. There's a rope at the back of him, made of 2 pieces of leather. They're plaited. On one end of this rope, they made an eye. They pulled through the other end, so there was a noose. They put the noose around his neck. So for Tolland man, the cause of death was hanging.
The face looks peaceful. The eyes are closed, and one may feel that this is a man who is almost at rest, and that's unusual. You can often have things like protruding tongue and from people who have been ligature strangled, because the mechanism of the rope is to actually push the tongue upwards and forwards, and it does then look like the person has had a violent struggle. It's not the case here.
Most of the material that archaeologists dig up are just bones. But these are whole bodies. They're almost like Egyptian mummies in a way, with their very own mystery. But whereas Egyptian mummies come with textual evidence, a lot of them come in coffins and that sort of thing, these are dug up from the peat in these cold, dark, wet corners of Europe. And they come from mysterious places. They're usually remote places, and they're cold, they're dark, they're wet.
You honoured the gods by making offerings in pools in peat bogs. You made sacrifices. The Celts on the whole didn't think of their gods as being up in the sky. They thought of them very often as being not infernal in the classical sense, not living in sort of dusty halls below the ground, but the entrance to the other world was down watery places.
I met this friend at a party, and she asked me if I'd heard about Glob and the Bog People. A book, she said, about Bog People, and I'd never heard of it. So a few days later, I found she'd given me this book, and she inscribed it to Bogman from Bogwoman. I was captivated by it. I read it from cover to cover, and was absolutely enthralled by the fact that there were so many bog bodies in Denmark, and that they were buried in this ritual manner.
Right, now this is where we've got the archives from Globe's time. It's an early number. In fact, it's 213. That's a number you don't forget.
213?
213.
Well,
there we are. Yes. In fact, there's two. It's a big file.
Okay. That's Globe?
That's Globe, yes. Yes. With one of the peat horses, I suppose. Yeah. And that must be the cutting where he was found. The most compelling thing about Globe's book is that it was one of the first books where, as it were, the scientific thesis, the scientific reporting of a scientific theory, or pattern of theories, was at the same time explained in a way that the non-specialist could understand and appreciate.
His big idea was that bog bodies are human sacrifices, people who played a role in a spring ritual. At the end of the ritual, they were killed and buried in a bog.
The Home Office pathologist had told us that this was a relatively modern burial of a woman between the ages of 25 and 35 of European origin, and the fact that we're already making inquiries into a murder in that specific area, obviously we had to seriously look that this was the remains of Mrs. Reyn-Bardt. It was then decided that we should go and confront Peter Reyn-Bardt with the evidence of the skull.
Peat
moss is immediately adjacent to the back garden of the cottage, and the skull was found approximately 300 yards from where we are now. We're walking up the back garden, and this ditch runs right the way down from the cottage along the far edge of the property. On the way from the police station to the cottage, Reyn-Bardt was very talkative, very affable, asking about the area, etc., because he hadn't been back here for some time. And when we pulled up outside, he got out of the car and suddenly started shaking, sweating. He went pale, clammy, and we had to sit him down on the bonnet of the car. And he went very, very peculiar. And we brought him in to the garden, and he was trembling the whole time that he was pointing out where he'd buried her. And so we quickly had to take him back to the police station then, and he was charged with the murder. However, even though we excavated such a large area, we found absolutely no other remains, and this did give us a problem. We wanted to prove beyond doubt that this was Mrs. Reyn-Bardt. So what we needed was a test to find out the actual age of the skull. The forensic lab eventually came back to us and said, yes, this test could be done, and there were only two places in Britain. That was Aldermaston and Professor Hall, who was at Oxford University.
I went down to the laboratory one day and found these two gentlemen in uniform with a hat box between them. And I said, what's in there? They said, well, perhaps you better have a look. And I took the top off the hat box, and inside was this skull. And it had a lot of flesh on it still. It had one eye in its socket. I think it's lost that now. But they said it couldn't possibly be more than 30 years old, so we want to see whether it's pre or post 1960. All living matter, whether they're humans or whether they're animals, whether they are trees or plants, they have a very small amount of this radiocarbon, carbon-14. Only about 1 part in a million. When the live object dies, this form of carbon-14 will decay at a very slow but well-known rate. So when we are going to do a date, if we can find the proportion of the carbon-14 in the object, we can say when it died. The dating took a month or so to do. I think they were very surprised.
The subject of the skull, reference SDD 1 and 2, that's the skull from the peat bog, died in the year AD 410, or within the margin of error previously outlined, i.e. between AD 210 and AD 610. There is no doubt over the validity of my conclusions. Well, as you can imagine, that threw a spanner in the works, really. We were left with a skull that was 1500 years old, and a man who'd confessed to the murder of his wife on the evidence of that skull.
I'm an archaeology student, and 28 months ago I buried a piglet and 4 trotters in a chunk of bog. I wanted to try and see whether they'd preserve, and now we're going to see whether or not that's actually happened.
Nope, they ain't gonna cut very easily.
Okay. Part of the problem with bogs is because they grow so quickly. You just never know where the growth is going to be and where you can put your pressure in because it's so wet today.
They got it. Have fun.
Right, you take that down another 6 inches, maybe less.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the trotter area, isn't it?
Yeah. The devils have buried themselves beautifully.
Right,
Okay,
wait,
there's
your
bits
hand
of fat. Yes. Right.
One disgusting
Pig
trotter.
One beautiful pig trotter. Yes. Look at that.
Wow.
That's fantastic. We've got good bone preservation. We've got bits of fat. Adipocere, that is adipocere. You can tell by the smell. And we've got beautiful, beautiful preservation. I'm finding on average what I'm getting is about 7 to 10% preservation out of everything I've buried. And I think that's fairly representative of the bodies. I think that really we only know of about 10% of what was originally buried. I think the rest just haven't survived. You notice?
What's that? There you go. Another bit.
Yes, we've got a bit of flesh. There you go. What our findings have shown is that it's very unlikely that peat bog bodies that were buried in peat cuts and then covered over with dry peat, it's very unlikely that those would preserve. I'm finding that areas which are wetter are better for preservation, so it's more likely that the bodies were put into a wet area, covered either with wet peat or in a peat pool area.
The Celts didn't love their gods. They didn't worship them in the sense that we today talk about worshipping God, but they wanted to keep on the right side of them. And by making offerings, they were doing this. And the offerings into water are one of the most common.
Oh, at one time, large parts of northwest Europe were covered by bogs. You could find them all over Ireland, Great Britain, northern part of the Netherlands, northern Germany, Poland and Denmark. At the moment we have records of about 2,000 bog bodies, but unfortunately many of them haven't been kept, but have disappeared shortly after their discovery.
You would throw into lakes and into pools treasure, if you had it, gold, silver, portion of your crops, things that would be prized by the gods and would be useful to them. And there were places that you wouldn't pass without making an offering.
We have many hundreds, even thousands of objects from the bogs. Shoes. This is a specimen from the Roman period, 3rd or 4th century AD. Here's something remarkable. It's a ball of wool. This left arm and hand we found in a local museum in the Peat region. It stuck out of a drawer. This pair of hair braids, which date from the early Iron Age, were deposited in a bog by a female person who asked for very simple things, good health or something like that. Bog bodies have to be seen in the same perspective. They were deliberately brought to the bogs and sacrificed to the supernatural powers, the gods, the spirits, probably the ancestors.
With Egyptian mummies and with bog bodies, we've got very, very, very different mechanisms of preservation. This is, as you can see, really, I'll remove this arm which has become detached. I mean, just have a look at that. Have a look at the fingers. They're completely dried, aren't they? And quite solid. And that's exactly what has happened. They dehydrated it with natron, which is native salt. And that removes all the moisture, and then they go through a complex embalming process, and they finish up looking fairly lifelike, don't they? But when we come to preservation of bog bodies, this is some bog tissue, some human tissue preserved in the bog. This is very, very different.
Does it smell?
Does it smell? Well, do you think it might smell?
Possibly.
Doesn't smell. We'll try. We'll try.
No, it doesn't at all.
No, it doesn't. No. We don't know exactly why the tissues are preserved. We've got a fairly good idea, but it's simply that it's cold, it's quite acid, there are no putrefying bacteria, and at the depths at which they're buried, a couple of meters, something like that, they're almost entirely anaerobic. So you've got no oxygen, it's cold, you've got no putrefying bacteria, no temperature, so that prevents the body rotting. But look at this tissue, just feel that. Just feel that. That's... Oh, have a feel.
Like leather.
That's it. That's exactly what it is, Rachel. It's like leather. It's been in the bog, and it's literally been tanned. The bog acids have literally converted it to leather. And so we finish up, really, with the two components of our bodies changing place, whereas our body is supported by our skeleton. In this case, the very fragile, demineralized skeleton is supported by the tanned soft tissue, by this leather case.
This is the body of Grauballe man. He was found in 1952, 2 years after Tolland man was discovered. Recent radiocarbon dates indicate that he died in the 4th or 3rd century BC, which means that he's more than 2,000 years old. The body has been preserved very well. The skin is all there, and with very interesting details. You can even see the papillary lines on his hand, so even his fingerprints could be taken. The hair on the head is there. It's as usual. It's red. Originally it was dark, but through chemical processes in the bog it turned red. This large gap, which runs from ear to ear, that was the cause of his death. His throat was cut. He also had some blows on his head and some fractures on his upper and lower left leg. His intestines have also been analyzed to find clues about composition of his last meal, and it became clear that his last meal consisted of a kind of soup or gruel with many kinds of weeds in it. Glob's conclusion was that this man was sacrificed in a spring ritual to appeal for a good harvest for the community of which he was a part.
Globe has provided us with this mythology and ritual married together. He finds these bodies that seem to have something around their neck and so on. Ritual killings. And then along comes archaeological science. Radiocarbon dating, pollen analysis, analysis of stomach contents, analysis of flesh, and so on and so forth. And these people all legitimize the original story. The myth can be demonstrated to be a fact. The ritual did take place. There is no question about it because modern science says so.
Eddie Slack from the works brought me out to the area they've been clearing the peat, and projecting out from near the bottom of one of these sections was a well-preserved flap of skin.
There was the possibility that it was Malika Reyn-Bardt, and therefore it was a police investigation, but it was much further from the house in actual fact than where we found the skull. When it was realised that this was an ancient burial, the coroner released the body to the archaeologists from the British Museum.
Linda man lived and died by the middle of the 1st century, which was a time of terrible upheaval because of the Romans advancing north in Britain and destroying the old Celtic world. So it was a very fraught time, and it was a time when you would expect human sacrifice.
He's a big, well-nourished individual. You can see the upper arms are really quite powerful. He was not your everyday run-of-the-mill peasant. He was probably somebody of some note, perhaps somebody of some rank in society.
The most valuable thing they had to offer their gods, or to propitiate the forces that seemed to be ranged against them, was somebody from their community who was valuable to them. A prince, a bard, a warrior, and perhaps they were willing sacrifices. They went to help out their community in leading them through these crises.
There was a very interesting and complex process of death. It belongs to a category, a ritual sacrificial category, we know a great deal about, and that we call the threefold death.
We have at least 3 forms of trauma to the head and neck.
There, top of the head, just towards the front, there is this dark patch. That is actually a very large wound in the front of his head. And if we look at this very, very close-up shot of the same thing, you can see this wide, double circular injury.
If we look at some x-rays, you can see the bone of the skull. And this is the cranial cavity where the brain is. And you can clearly see there is a defect here, and there is a piece of bone that has been driven into the center of the brain.
The interesting feature now we look at is this string around his neck. It's made of twisted sinew, animal sinew of some sort, and it's tied. At the very back we can, yes, you can just see the knot there where it's tied at the back of his neck, and each end of this string, we'll call it for the time being, around his neck, is secured with an overhand hitch at the end to prevent it from fraying.
Unconsciousness is usually quite quick after the application of a ligature. Probably 30 seconds to a minute at most, the person would be rendered unconscious, if not dead.
There's the garrote there. You can see the thong at the front of the neck. You can see it lying in a groove there.
You can see that very well from this angle, yes. If you put her fingers in the way now.
It's trying to get the camera to... You start getting the... You haven't got the right line.
At a fairly late stage in the clearing of the peat from around the body, the head was pushed back and lifted up to reveal the neck, and lo and behold, it revealed what appears to be a short cut wound in the neck.
Further examination of neck structures did confirm that this is in fact an incised or stab wound where a sharp cutting implement, and almost certainly a knife, has been used on the victim. We've got a blow to the head, stab wound to the head, and we've got the garrote.
Well, the number 3 was the most sacred and important number in Celtic mythology. It signified, as it were, completion. The triple death was just in keeping with this feeling that the threeness was a completeness and perfection.
Here we have Lindo Man, one of the most popular exhibits in the museum. Certainly one of the things that people ask for constantly. He was found in a peat bog in Lindo Moss in Cheshire in 1984, probably the result of a ritual sacrifice.
The thing about ritual is that the archaeologists like to think to the sensational. They like to think to the supernatural and to the dramatic. they don't tend to look for practical answers to practical questions.
It has been suggested that archaeologists overinterpret the scientific data to produce a good story, but overall this isn't the case. The association between archaeologists and their scientific colleagues is very, very good and very, very secure.
The girl was found more than 100 years ago in May 1897 by two workmen dredging for peat in a very small bog near the hamlet of Ide. It's very well visible that her wisdom teeth are not yet erupted, which gives us an idea of her age. Something between 15 and 17 years old. There is this beautiful plaited band around her neck. It has been wound 3 times and there is a slip knot in it. There is a very deep impression made by the slip knot, which was drawn very tight under her left ear. Other people in her time got a decent burial in a normal cemetery, whereas she ended up in a bog. In my opinion, Ide girl and many other people found in the bogs have been sacrificed. We are dealing with sacrifices.
Many bog bodies do have lots of evidence for ritual sacrifice, with great nooses around their necks, with their throats cut, pegged down by their wrists and their ankles in their watery graves deep, deep down in these cold peat bogs. And so really from the very minute that Lindo Man started emerging from his Cheshire peat bog, there was a desire amongst a large number of people involved that it should be a ritual sacrifice, a really good archaeological find, not just a bog body, but a really great archaeological find showing us all the evidence of ritual sacrifice. And I think in some cases everybody's interpretation, or some people's interpretations of every piece of evidence was in fact put in the book of ritual sacrifice rather than the alternative explanations. If you were going to garrote somebody with the intention of killing them, I think it unlikely that you would use such a fine and beautifully tied piece of sinew. It looks to me rather more like a necklace, actually.
But if that's the case, then, you know, why is there a ligature mark? Because the ligature mark indicates compression.
If you tightened it up as much as that, then that would have caused damage to the cartilages in the throat, to the laryngeal cartilages, and although that wouldn't cause death, we would see this on the CT scans and on the x-rays, and there is no damage to the laryngeal cartilages.
Classic strangulation in this case with a ligature.
I think it's a necklace. Nothing more.
This injury here, which is in the neck, is in fact a stab wound.
It looks newish to me. It could have been an accidental slice. I think everybody who was working on the body at the time would deny that. But whatever it is, if you were going to bleed somebody to death for ritual purposes or something like that, in order to make an incision like that, you would essentially have had to say, hold still, old chap, now just a minute, I'm just going to get my knife, I'm just going to stick it in your neck like that. Compare it with Graubella Man, with his throat cut from ear to ear. That's a good ritual bleeding, that is.
Peat bogs are dangerous places. People get murdered. People get buried. But I think the overwhelming weight of the evidence, the comparative evidence and the other strands, particularly the folk tales, really demand us to look at ritual execution and sacrifice as the best explanation.
I don't think we have enough evidence to write in the history books that ritual sacrifice was practiced in Iron Age Cheshire. I think we can say that they beat each other up, but I don't think we can say ritual sacrifice.
I think this could be a ritual sacrifice, but I'm not convinced.
This is the particular type of peat that has preserved the Lindo bodies and all the other famous bog bodies, and it's dominated by sphagnum moss, and it's the particular chemical properties of the decaying sphagnum that preserves the tissue of these bodies that makes the discovery so spectacular. If we sweep around and look over the remainder of the bog, you have laid out the history of our more distant past. The black peats, are sedges, grasses, reeds decayed, are probably from the Bronze Age. And then if we look over here, this remarkable collection of pine stumps from a forest that was growing here in the Neolithic, perhaps in the order of 7,000 years ago. So the whole history of our local climate and our local vegetation is spread out before us on this peat bog.
We really want to know, sir, how old is Linlow Man?
2 laboratories have been working on this. One has produced a date which, when calibrated, is early in the 6th century AD. And the second has produced a date which, when calibrated, is in the 1st century AD. So there's quite a big difference there. And the radiocarbon dates for the peat are in the 3rd or 4th century BC when calibrated.
So how many years is the discrepancy at the moment?
It's damn near 1,000 years,
It's
isn't
nearly
it?
nearly a whole millennium.
Yeah, a millennium, yes.
The interesting thing about carbon dating and bog bodies is that there you can have a body that's actually quite recent, but in fact the carbon dating would suggest it's quite old, because essentially the body absorbs the age of the bog, not of how long the body has been in the bog, and therefore there is an argument that more modern bodies can actually appear older than they are.
In the case of the Lindo Man, we would know that it was liable to contamination with the surrounding material, and we'd make an estimate of what that is likely to be. It would in fact in this case likely to be rather older, appear older than it actually was, but the amount of contamination is well known, and so we can state the date plus or minus a certain percentage, and we are very certain that the date of the object will be within that range.
The difficulties over the radiocarbon date I think we're beginning to understand, and I believe the radiocarbon dates are in fact accurate. To imagine or create a scenario where they are as wrong as 2,000 years is almost impossible.
You'll find that if an archaeologist were to be taken to court for some of the things that he has to say and he is certain about, he'd probably not be very successful with a lot of his cases. What we're often faced with is not so much was it probable, but was it possible? And if we start dealing in possibilities, then it could have been almost anything that happened in the past.
Eventually, Reyn-Bardt appeared at Chester Crown Court, where he was convicted and sent to prison for life.
It is pretty unusual to have a conviction of a murder without a body, but it does happen. And obviously one has to have some fairly good evidence from the person who carried out the murder that it has occurred, either a confession or very, very strong circumstantial evidence.
I think everybody who was involved in the inquiry became all consumed in this thing of finding Maria's body. I even used to have a spade in the back of the car, and on odd occasions came out to the cottage and dug in the wood at the side there, but never ever found anything, and to this day there's never been any remains of Maria found.
This is the skull that was found in the peat bog. This is an adult female skull. We can see this from the smoothness of the skull and the fact that the forehead at the junction of the eyes is pretty flat. The other feature is that it has tissue in the eye sockets, which could either be decomposed tissue from fairly modern times, or it could be from ancient remains if they are preserved in something like a peat bog.
When Dr. Benstead brought this skull into my room, we estimated it to be between 20 and 50 years old. So we were rather surprised when I was told of the radiocarbon date. But I would still stand by my estimate, the estimate that Dr. Benstead and I made, that this was between 20 and 50 years old and was a recent murder case.
When we look at a photograph of this lady and compare it to the skull, she has a broad area between her eyes and her lower forehead, where the nose is, and you can see a similar broad area on the skull. I think also the other interesting thing about it is that the contour of the side of the eye on the photograph with the contour on the side of the eye on the skull are fairly similar. Certainly is an interesting and intriguing point. It would suggest to me that there are features here on the photograph of this lady and this skull which could be consistent. In other words, they could be from the same person. In my view, there is nothing to exclude that skull belonging to this lady.